September 25, 1944, 8:30 a.m. Montgomery's headquarters, Brussels. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery sat at his desk reading the latest casualty reports from Operation Market Garden. 9 days. That's how long the operation had lasted. 9 days that were supposed to end the war by Christmas. 9 days that instead ended in disaster. Over 17,000 Allied soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. The British 1st Airborne Division had been destroyed. The bridge at Arnhem, the bridge too far, remained in German hands. And now Montgomery had to explain to Eisenhower, to Churchill, to the world, how his master plan had failed. Montgomery's chief of staff later recalled that the field marshal showed no visible emotion as he reviewed the reports. His face remained composed, almost serene. But those who knew him well noticed something else. Montgomery was already preparing his defense. He picked up a pen and began drafting a message that would shock Allied headquarters. Market Garden hadn't failed because of his planning. It hadn't failed because of his decisions. According to Montgomery, Market Garden failed because Dwight Eisenhower had sabotaged it. This is a story about what happens when a brilliant commander refuses to admit failure. If you want more deep dives into the commanders who won and lost the war, the decisions they made, and the egos that shaped history, hit subscribe. We're building something special here. What Montgomery wrote in the days after Market Garden would nearly destroy the Allied command structure. Eisenhower was furious but trapped. He needed Montgomery. Churchill backed Montgomery. And Montgomery knew it. This wasn't just about one failed operation. This was about who would control Allied strategy for the rest of the war. And Montgomery was determined that it would be him, even if it meant rewriting history while the bodies were still being counted. To understand why Montgomery blamed everyone but himself, you need to understand who Montgomery was. And you need to understand what he believed about his place in military history. Bernard Montgomery was not a humble man. While other British commanders spoke carefully about their abilities, Montgomery announced that he was the finest general Britain had produced since Wellington. He told subordinates that he never made mistakes. He told Churchill that if given proper resources, he alone could win the war. Some of this was showmanship. Montgomery understood that soldiers needed to believe their commander was infallible. But much of it was genuine belief. Montgomery truly thought he was a military genius surrounded by inferiors. His soldiers loved him. Montgomery visited frontline units constantly. He learned the names of junior officers. He made sure his men had hot meals and dry socks before every battle. British troops who had been beaten in North Africa for 2 years finally won at El Alamein under Montgomery's command. To them, Montgomery was the man who had broken Rommel. They trusted him completely. His fellow commanders despised him. American generals thought Montgomery was slow, arrogant, and took credit for victories he didn't earn. British generals resented his constant self-promotion and his habit of blaming others when things went wrong. Even Churchill, who usually supported Montgomery, sometimes found him insufferable. After one particularly boastful meeting, Churchill told his aide that Montgomery was either a military genius or a dangerous egomaniac, and he wasn't sure which. Montgomery's command philosophy was simple. Plan everything in meticulous detail. Build up overwhelming force. Attack only when success was certain. Never improvise. Never take risks. This approach had worked at El Alamein, where Montgomery spent months preparing before attacking. It worked in Sicily, where Montgomery advanced methodically while Patton raced ahead. But it drove Eisenhower crazy. While Montgomery prepared, German armies escaped. While Montgomery built up supplies, opportunities disappeared. By September 1944, their relationship was strained to the breaking point. Montgomery believed Eisenhower was a mediocre general who had gotten his position through politics, not ability. Eisenhower believed Montgomery was brilliant but impossible, a commander whose ego was becoming a strategic liability. The situation that led to Market Garden began in early September, when Allied armies liberated Paris and raced across France. For 3 months, Allied forces had been stuck in Normandy fighting brutal battles in the hedgerows. Then, suddenly, the German army collapsed. American and British forces advanced so fast they outran their supply lines. Everyone believed the war was almost over. Montgomery proposed an audacious plan. Drop 3 airborne divisions behind German lines in Holland. Capture the bridges over the Rhine at Arnhem. British armored forces would race up a single highway, linking up with each airborne division in sequence. Once across the Rhine, Allied forces could swing into Germany's industrial heartland. The war would end before winter. It was the most aggressive plan Montgomery had ever proposed, and Eisenhower approved it. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems. Intelligence reports indicated 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem. Montgomery dismissed these reports. The Dutch resistance warned that German forces in the area were stronger than Allied intelligence believed. Montgomery ignored them. His own staff officers pointed out that the plan required everything to go perfectly, with no margin for error. Montgomery told them he had never made a bad plan. The real problem, though, was supplies. The Allied advance across France had created a logistics crisis. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every replacement tank had to be trucked from Normandy. The ports in Normandy couldn't handle the volume. The port of Antwerp had been captured, but its approaches were still in German hands. Montgomery needed Antwerp to open before launching Market Garden. Instead, he chose to attack while the logistics situation was deteriorating. Eisenhower had approved Market Garden, but reluctantly. His strategy was the broad front approach. All Allied armies would advance together into Germany, stretching German defenses until they broke. Montgomery hated this strategy. He wanted all resources concentrated for his thrust into Holland. He had been lobbying Eisenhower for weeks to give him priority over American forces. Eisenhower refused. The Americans were advancing rapidly in the south. Patton's Third Army was approaching the German border. Bradley's armies were pushing through Belgium. Eisenhower wasn't going to stop the American advance to support Montgomery's single thrust. So Montgomery launched Market Garden knowing he didn't have the supplies he wanted. Knowing intelligence indicated serious German strength ahead. Knowing the plan had no backup options if things went wrong. He launched it anyway because he believed his reputation as an infallible commander would carry the operation through. And he launched it while already preparing to blame Eisenhower if it failed. On September 17th, the largest airborne operation in history began. American paratroopers dropped at Eindhoven and Nijmegen. British paratroopers dropped at Arnhem. For the first 24 hours, everything went according to plan. Then reality hit. The British armored column advancing up the highway ran into fierce German resistance. The single road became clogged with destroyed vehicles. Without room to maneuver, British tanks became targets. The advance that was supposed to take hours stretched into days. At Arnhem, British paratroopers discovered that intelligence had been right. 2 SS Panzer divisions were there, and they were far from the exhausted remnants Montgomery expected. The paratroopers fought desperately but were gradually surrounded. Radio equipment failed. Supply drops missed their targets. The bridge at Arnhem, the objective of the entire operation, remained just out of reach. Montgomery watched his plan unravel, and he made a choice that would define the rest of his career. He decided this wasn't his fault. On September 22nd, with the British paratroopers at Arnhem in desperate straits, Montgomery sent a message to Eisenhower. The message didn't ask for help. It didn't acknowledge that the operation was failing. Instead, it criticized Eisenhower's strategy. Montgomery wrote that Market Garden would have succeeded if Eisenhower had given him the supplies he requested. He claimed American operations in the South had drawn resources away from the real opportunity in the North. He suggested that Eisenhower's broad front strategy was prolonging the war. The message stunned Eisenhower's staff. Market Garden was still ongoing. British soldiers were dying at Arnhem, and Montgomery was using the crisis to renew his strategic arguments. Eisenhower read the message twice, then put it aside. He was too busy trying to salvage what he could from the operation to respond to Montgomery's blame-shifting. On September 25th, the remnants of the British 1st Airborne Division retreated across the Rhine. Of the 10,000 men who had dropped at Arnhem, only 2,000 made it back. Montgomery's plan had failed catastrophically. That same day, Montgomery held a meeting with his senior staff. According to officers who were present, Montgomery never mentioned his own planning decisions. He never discussed the intelligence warnings his staff had raised. Instead, he talked about supply shortages, about Eisenhower's strategic mistakes, about American failures to support the operation properly. One staff officer, Major General Francis de Gingand, tried to raise concerns about how this would look to Allied headquarters. Montgomery cut him off. The Field Marshal said that history would judge Market Garden as a bold operation that nearly succeeded, undone only by insufficient support from above. Then Montgomery did something that shocked even his own staff. He drafted a formal report to Churchill arguing that Eisenhower should be removed as ground forces commander. Montgomery claimed that Eisenhower's inexperience and poor strategic judgment were costing lives and prolonging the war. He suggested that a single ground forces commander, meaning himself, should control all Allied armies. And he used Market Garden's failure as evidence that his approach was right and Eisenhower's was wrong. Churchill received Montgomery's report and immediately saw the political disaster it would cause. The Americans would never accept Montgomery in command. Eisenhower had Roosevelt's complete backing. If Churchill supported Montgomery's claim, it could fracture the alliance. Churchill wrote back telling Montgomery to focus on opening Antwerp and to stop criticizing the Supreme Commander. Montgomery ignored him. On September 28th, he sent another message to Eisenhower, this one more aggressive. He wrote that the current command structure was unsound. He claimed that operations were being conducted without proper coordination. He stated bluntly that someone needed to control ground operations, and that someone should be him. Eisenhower's response was swift and angry. He wrote back that he was tired of Montgomery's constant criticism. He pointed out that Market Garden had been Montgomery's plan, approved despite Eisenhower's reservations. He noted that Montgomery had been given priority for supplies for the operation, and he made clear that the command structure would not change. Eisenhower ended the message by telling Montgomery to stop sending complaints and start opening the port of Antwerp. But Montgomery wouldn't let it go. Over the next month, he continued to send messages criticizing Eisenhower's broad front strategy. He gave interviews to British journalists suggesting that American commanders lacked the sophistication for European warfare. He told his staff that Market Garden would have worked if only Eisenhower had understood its potential. The truth was more complicated and more damning. Market Garden failed for multiple reasons, and Montgomery was responsible for most of them. First, the intelligence. Multiple sources had warned that German forces near Arnhem were stronger than expected. Montgomery dismissed these warnings because they conflicted with his plan. A Dutch resistance officer had provided photographs showing German tanks near the drop zones. Montgomery's intelligence staff buried the report. After the battle, it turned out the warnings were accurate. The two SS Panzer divisions were exactly where intelligence said they would be. Second, the planning. The entire operation depended on a single highway. If that highway was blocked at any point, the whole operation failed. Montgomery's staff had pointed this out. They suggested alternative routes or contingency plans. Montgomery refused. He believed speed and boldness would overcome tactical problems. When the highway became blocked, there was no plan B. Third, the timing. Montgomery launched Market Garden while the logistics crisis was getting worse, not better. Eisenhower had told him to open Antwerp first, then launch the operation with proper supply support. Montgomery wanted the glory of ending the war with one decisive blow. He couldn't wait. The result was that his armored columns ran out of fuel and ammunition at critical moments. Fourth, the airborne drops. Because of limited aircraft, The paratroopers had to be dropped over 3 days instead of all at once. This gave the Germans time to react. Montgomery knew this would be a problem but accepted it because he didn't want to wait for additional aircraft. The British paratroopers at Arnhem were outnumbered from the start because their reinforcements arrived too late. Fifth, the radios. British airborne forces had radio equipment that didn't work properly in wooded terrain. This was a known problem. Montgomery's staff had recommended using American radio equipment, which was more reliable. Montgomery refused because he didn't want to depend on American supplies. The result was that British commanders at Arnhem couldn't communicate with each other or with headquarters. Supply drops landed in German-held territory because pilots couldn't receive updated coordinates. Every one of these problems could be traced back to decisions Montgomery made or approved. But Montgomery never acknowledged any of them. Instead, he created a narrative where Market Garden was a bold plan that nearly worked, defeated only by insufficient support and Eisenhower's strategic timidity. The aftermath was brutal. 17,000 Allied casualties. An entire British airborne division destroyed. Dutch civilians who had welcomed the Allies faced German reprisals. The port of Antwerp remained closed for another month while Montgomery finally followed Eisenhower's original orders. And the war, which Montgomery promised would end by Christmas, dragged on for another 8 months. Eisenhower wanted to fire Montgomery. His chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, drafted orders relieving Montgomery of command. But Eisenhower couldn't do it. Churchill backed Montgomery. British public opinion saw Montgomery as a hero. Firing him would create a political crisis that could damage the alliance. So Eisenhower swallowed his anger and kept Montgomery in command. But their relationship was permanently damaged. Eisenhower stopped consulting Montgomery on major strategic decisions. He gave American commanders priority for supplies. When Montgomery asked to lead the final assault into Germany, Eisenhower gave the mission to Bradley instead. Montgomery had played politics and lost. German commanders, reading captured Allied communications, were amazed by what they saw. General Gerd von Rundstedt later said that Market Garden was the most poorly planned major operation the Allies conducted. He couldn't understand why Montgomery had attacked with such obvious weaknesses in the plan. And he noted that instead of learning from the failure, Allied commanders had spent weeks arguing about whose fault it was. The historical verdict has been harsh. Most military historians agree that Market Garden was an operational disaster caused by Montgomery's overconfidence and poor planning. Some argue that the concept was sound but the execution was flawed. Almost none blame Eisenhower's broad front strategy for the failure. Montgomery had been given what he asked for, and he had failed. But Montgomery never admitted this. For the rest of his life, he maintained that Market Garden nearly succeeded and would have succeeded with proper support. In his memoirs, published in 1958, he blamed American commanders, supply shortages, bad weather, and Eisenhower's strategic judgment. He never mentioned the intelligence warnings he ignored, the planning problems his staff raised, or the decisions he made that doomed the operation. This refusal to accept responsibility defined Montgomery's relationship with American commanders for the rest of the war. Patton, who already disliked Montgomery, called him a fraud who took credit for victories and blamed others for defeats. Bradley said Montgomery was the most difficult Allied commander to work with. Even British commanders grew tired of Montgomery's constant self-justification. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 made things worse. Montgomery was temporarily given command of American forces north of the German breakthrough. He performed competently but then held a press conference suggesting that British forces had saved the Americans from disaster. American generals were furious. Eisenhower had to threaten resignation to stop a full political crisis. Montgomery finally apologized, but the damage was done. So when Market Garden failed and Montgomery blamed Eisenhower, he wasn't just making excuses for one operation. He was establishing a pattern that would define the last months of the war in Europe. Every disagreement became a test of wills. Every failure became someone else's fault. And the alliance that had liberated Europe came close to fracturing because one brilliant commander couldn't admit he had made a mistake. What Market Garden teaches us is that ego can be as dangerous as any enemy army. Montgomery was a talented commander. His meticulous planning saved lives. His concern for his soldiers inspired loyalty. But his inability to admit failure made him a strategic liability. Eisenhower had to spend as much time managing Montgomery's ego as he did managing the war against Germany. There's a broader lesson here about leadership under pressure. When things go wrong, the natural human instinct is to find someone else to blame. Montgomery gave in to that instinct completely. He convinced himself that Market Garden's failure was beyond his control, that he had done everything right, and that others had let him down. This self-deception might have protected his ego, but it prevented him from learning from his mistakes. When the next crisis came, Montgomery made similar errors because he hadn't acknowledged the first ones. Eisenhower took a different approach. When operations failed, he accepted responsibility publicly and then analyzed privately what went wrong. After the Kasserine Pass disaster in 1943, Eisenhower didn't blame his subordinate commanders. He took responsibility, then quietly replaced the officers who had performed poorly. After Market Garden, even though Montgomery had ignored his advice, Eisenhower didn't say "I told you so." He focused on solving the logistics crisis and getting the Allied advance moving again. The contrast between the two men's approaches explains why Eisenhower was Supreme Commander and Montgomery wasn't. Eisenhower understood that in a coalition, protecting relationships was as important as winning battles. Montgomery never learned this lesson. After the war, historians found German documents that revealed something Montgomery never knew. Hitler had ordered his commanders to defend Arnhem at all costs because he understood that if the Allies crossed the Rhine there, his entire Western Front would collapse. The Germans threw every available unit into the battle. They fought with desperate determination because they knew what was at stake. Market Garden didn't fail because of insufficient Allied supplies or poor strategic coordination. It failed because the Germans defended better than Montgomery expected. But admitting that would have required Montgomery to acknowledge that his plan had underestimated the enemy. He couldn't do it. One final irony. In 1947, Montgomery visited the battlefield at Arnhem. Dutch civilians who remembered the battle showed him the drop zones, the bridge, the positions where British paratroopers had made their last stand. Montgomery walked through the cemetery where thousands of his soldiers were buried. A Dutch woman asked him why the operation had failed. Montgomery told her it hadn't failed. He said it was 90% successful. The woman looked at the graves and walked away. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of World War II's most controversial moments. If you want more stories about the decisions and personalities that shaped the war, check out our video on why Eisenhower and Patton nearly destroyed their friendship in 1943. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. These stories deserve to be told right, without the Hollywood myths, just the complicated truth about the leaders who won the war.